Hello! I'm excited to be joining everyone tonight to kick off Gatorade Performance Partners Expert Chat. This is our final chat in the series. Thank you for tuning in every week. Throughout this conversation, we'll be taking questions from the audience, so please drop your questions into the comment section. My name is Kim Stein. I'm a senior principal scientist with the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, and I lead our education and athlete testing programs. Recently, we've been collaborating with the Corey Stringer Institute on return to play guidance related to heat and hydration, and I've had the pleasure of working with leading dietitians Leslie Bonci, Jen Ketterly, and Roberta Anding from the Performance 365 team to develop nutrition guidelines as we return to sports. We'll be debuting a series of tools and resources across the Corey Stringer Institute website, the GSSI website, and Gatorade Performance Partner in the next few weeks and months, and a few of them are posted on Gatorade Performance Partner tonight, so stay tuned for more. I'm pleased to be joined tonight by Leslie and Jen from Performance 365 to discuss these nutrition and hydration considerations as sports ramp back up. To begin with, Leslie, can you share a little bit about your background and what you anticipate being the biggest change as it relates to keeping our athletes and performance teams safe in this changing landscape?
Sure. Hi, Kim, and hi, everybody. I am thrilled to be here tonight. I have been a registered dietitian for 30-some years and a sports dietitian for that long, CSSD as well, and have had the pleasure and honor over my career to work with a lot of athletes from the high school, collegiate, Olympic, and professional level. And very excited to say, having worked with the Kansas City Chiefs over this past year. So when we think about this time of the year and return to play as, oh, there hasn't been any play. That's a big difference. Is we have athletes that have been relatively idle at home. And now when we think about safety and all the things we usually do to be proactive, we are really trying to pivot in that conversation and think about safety at a very different level. Safety, that internal safety of hygiene, that safety of, are you ready to resume play? Do you know what it takes to wear a mask and social distance and all of those types of things that have never, ever, ever been part of the athlete's verbiage before. So it's going to present challenges to all of us, but that also means it's going to present opportunities to us as we all are on a learning curve to get through this.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for joining us tonight. Next up is Jen. Jen, tell us about your background and your thoughts on sport nutrition and sideline safety as we get back to playing sports.
Sure. Well, thanks, Kim. It's great to be here with you and Leslie this evening to talk about this topic. My background as a registered dietitian has taken me for 20 years through the collegiate and professional practices through different and varying levels, also on the research and teaching side of things in our field. And as we think about this topic, first off, I think we have to acknowledge that managing a pandemic is not in anyone's job description, right? So this is hard. This is new, and we've all got to acknowledge that and perhaps reset some expectations for ourselves and our team, and just know this is a really challenging time. As nutrition professionals, this is a time for us to reach to the full scope of our training. And possibly to also reach back up onto the bookshelves and dust off those resources that may have some cobwebs on topics like food safety and management. And I know we're going to dive into some of those things this evening. But as far as sideline goes, this is, flexibility is going to be the name of the game. As we know, things are changing day by day. And being prepared and being flexible to move and adjust and evolve as the situation does is going to be important, as well as having perhaps some design thinking as we reimagine and perhaps even re-engineer some of the key concepts of sports and pieces like sideline management and meal planning for teams.
Thanks, Jen. I have a feeling our viewers are going to be very happy that you dove back into those textbooks. And I want to know more about the design thinking. Before we dive in, a friendly reminder, please submit your questions through the comment section, and we're going to answer as many of those that we can tonight. To get us started, I'm going to send our first question to Leslie, and that is, how can athletic trainers, strength coaches, and RDs all work together to successfully navigate this changing landscape?
Well, and that really is the important component of it, is working together. Is we have to find that way to collaborate. We have to find that way to communicate and present that united front, because as you just heard from Jen, this is uncharted territories for most of us. Everybody is going to be out of their comfort zone because it is very, very overwhelming. But yet, everybody brings that expertise to the table. We already have the rapport established with our athletes, and maybe we have to sit down and communicate and designate and delegate what it is that those responsibilities will be. For instance, who's going to be the enforcer to make sure that the athletes are wearing masks and they're social distancing? Who is going to be the liaison with food service to ensure that we are doing the right types of things? Who is going to be making sure that in the weight training room that we have athletes doing what they're supposed to do? How are they going to hydrate appropriately? And how are we going to get the coach to buy into all of this? Because it really has to start from the top and then trickle down. But if we are all there and presenting the united front, knowing what we know, what we're already doing well, what we have to work on, it's going to be much easier and less bumpy as we go through all of this.
Thanks, Leslie. I agree. The united front is so important. I think you could give lessons on being the enforcer, right?
Yes.
Okay, the next question let's send over to Jen. What has been the most interesting thing you've seen launched already as programs gear up to return to sports or are starting to plan to return to sports?
Sure. Well, I think everyone is trying to be creative and look at different ways to do things. And I think in terms of newness, it's really reimagining that sideline and sort of scrapping it all and thinking about how we can manage the cleaning and sanitizing process from top to bottom. And so really more so than a thing, it's a process. And I think what I've seen is task force and teams really pulling together and coming together to reimagine these things for the goal of the health and safety of our athletes.
Mm-hmm. Leslie, Jen mentioned the sidelines. Can you give us some more thoughts about setting up the sidelines and fueling stations to make sure we're protecting our athletes?
Well, one of the things that we want to think about, and I'll talk a little bit about the fueling station aspect of this, is where are the fueling stations going to be and where are they not going to be right now? Because again, we're trying to keep things as safe as possible and we're trying to minimize that cluster of athletes in any given place. So fueling stations in the weight room, no. Might there be fewer fueling stations around, depending upon where you are? Yes. Are the foods offered going to be in a different form? Absolutely, because it's not going to be buffet. It's buffet stay away. It's going to be things that are prepackaged, so there are fewer touch points that are there. It's not going to be things in dispensers. It's not going to be things where we ask the athletes to use the blenders themselves because we can't, because of the big concern about how quickly germs can spread when we have all of these touch points going on. So to our athletes, they might think that this is relatively sterile. To all of us, it allows us to stop hyperventilating because we're controlling what we can by having that clean team. And the fact of the matter is that all needs to be communicated, because we're going to have athletes that are going to come in and say, where's the smoothie machine? Where's this? Where's that? How come we can't have it anymore? And really being able to reiterate that message over and over again is, this is for your safety. This is for the safety of your teammates. This is why we are doing things this way. So you actually can have a season, be on the field, and not on the sidelines because you've gotten sick.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So safety, like you're talking about, is so important in terms of food safety and good hygiene. And then there's also kind of inside the athlete's body and what they're putting in that can help them stay safe and healthy. So Jen, talking about what we are actually feeding athletes in the right way, are there guidelines for nutrition to help them support their immune function?
Sure, and I think this is a piece that is so important, and it's great for nutrition professionals because it gives us this gives us a chance and opportunity to really step up and help educate and make sure that nutrition is part of return to play, because it is in so many ways, not only from the food safety standpoint, but in regards to that individual athlete. So when we think about some of the key or foundational concepts that we want to have in place, making sure that our carbohydrate and protein needs are being met in an appropriate manner, and we all know those guidelines. And those are key because we know that as athletes better meet their carbohydrate needs, their stress levels and their inflammatory responses are lower. Similarly, from a protein standpoint, we may have athletes that come back to us that have lost a ton of lean body mass. They may have gained a lot of body fat. We don't know. So we've got to really do a great assessment and make sure that those carb and protein needs are dialed in to their needs, not only from where they were, but maybe where they need to go. And from a micronutrient standpoint, we know that this concept of tolerogenic supplements and tolerogenic nutrients such as vitamin C, vitamin D, probiotics perhaps, can really support the athlete's immune system and may not necessarily erase the risk of getting a viral infection, but certainly can reduce the severity, duration, and the impact of that infection if in fact it does happen. So looking at adequate vitamin C, looking at adequate vitamin D status, calling on supplements if we need to, and certainly looking at probiotic. And I know we're going to have some resources available for that as well.
And Kim, let me just add to that is we also got to think the other side of it is what are athletes maybe not doing right, is who's been on a very low calorie diet because all of a sudden they realize, I've got to get back to the field and there's more of me here than I want. That can be a problem. Alcohol use, we know, can definitely be a detriment in terms of having a healthy immune system. Even having enough sleep is a problem, and let alone all of the misinformation that's been out there over the past couple of months of just take colloidal silver and life will be fine. And that isn't the case. So really wanting to make sure, and that's one of the things we've developed is this checklist so that athletes can actually check and see, am I doing the right types of things to support a healthy immune system? And it's a scoring system. So yes, you're doing fine. Maybe you're doing okay, or you better go back to the drawing board. These are the things that are really critically important, so we address all sides.
Yeah. And Leslie, I'll add on to that. I think you brought up a great point of, supplements, possible supplements. Athletes may have strong interest in, who knows, lots of reasons, right, to want to take a nutritional supplement. And this, I think, is a really important time for sports medicine staff, sports performance staffs to re-up on the supplement safety protocols that are in place. And if you don't have one, this is a great time to work with your sports dietitian and the performance team to put one in place.
And I would add one other thing to that is, as we have athletes that are starting to return, is sometimes we have to ask the maybe uncomfortable question to us, or to them, is who hasn't been able to eat well over these past couple of months? Because guess what? There probably are a lot of athletes that will be the case for. And then we identify them as high risk. So at least we know how to move forward with them, how to help them the best that they can, so it not have to play so much catch up.
Thanks, both. You guys are making my job super easy tonight. So let's move on from nutrition, micronutrients, supplements, what to do and not to do. We haven't talked yet about fluid and that component of nutrition, being hydrated. So Leslie, let's stick with you for the moment. What are some key safety guidelines to follow when you're trying to keep your athletes hydrated during this current COVID-19 condition?
Well, when we were putting together the materials, we talked about this idea of touchless hydration, which doesn't mean that the fluid magically appears in your mouth, but it also means that there's fewer touch points across the board. No sharing bottles. If you spit, you sit. That's the way it is. We want fluids in the body, not anywhere else. Having even the idea of a designated pourer, that it's not going to be free for all, that is going to be critically important. And certainly the idea of the cleanliness around the bottle, that they are going to have to be sanitized after every use so that we don't run the risk of an athlete unknowingly getting ill. And this is not just the responsibility of the athletic trainers. It is also what happens when that athlete is home or in their dorm room or wherever else it is. The responsibility doesn't stop when the whistle blows and practice is done. That responsibility is 24/7. So we want to put some of that on the athlete himself or herself to be able to make sure that they're doing the right things with hydration.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add something there? Sure.
Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, when we think about hydrating our athletes, we certainly have to think about the equipment that goes along with that process. And, one of the things as we were putting together materials and reviewing the research that comes out daily on these topics is assessing hydration as well. And, as we look to go into training camps for fall sports, particularly those in the outdoor sports, the idea of hydration monitoring is an important one to think critically about. A lot of teams and a lot of practitioners will use a USG test to monitor high-risk athletes or groups of athletes through this process. And I think it's important to point out that we don't really know if the virus is shedding in the urine. There are certainly some reports that say yes. There are some that say maybe not or very little. But bottom line is that point is conflicting at this point. And so I think thinking critically about how you handle assessing and monitoring hydration status, particularly if USG is going to be part of your protocol, would be to really consider how you manage and touch and handle those specimens. And I also think that this is a great opportunity to return to the good old standard urine color chart as a means of monitoring and really reinforcing that education for the student athletes. And as Leslie said, to put some of that responsibility there within the athletes themselves to monitor their own hydration. That's going to be important as athletes come back and work out and train in the heat.
And as we don't always know where this virus is taking us, or any virus for that matter, or how long it's going to stick around, or anything else, is, as in so many practices, is I have a cup of something, I throw it on the ground. No more. Well, that's good. So we have the litter police that are part of this as well. But the idea of being able to have a red disposable bag, that we're getting rid of anything that could be a problem in any way, shape, or form. It is not worth it to take a chance.
Thank you. And we have a question from Sarah. And Sarah brings up a question of something you haven't mentioned yet. And what are your thoughts on the effects of hydration if you have to wear a mask more often than not? Leslie, should we start with you?
Yes, and actually this is one of the things that we talked about when we put the material together. And as it might sound a little silly to say, but what's going to need to happen, you think about athletes that are in the training room, and this idea of, okay, we're going to have scheduled breaks, it's time to have fluid, and really, whether it's a video in the training room or a demo or whatever it is, mask on, mask off, how do you do that appropriately so you're not touching your face and doing all those things? It is not normal for anybody to wear a mask on a regular basis unless they're a surgeon. So everybody has to know it's a learning curve. Same thing when we're looking in the weight room and, if necessary, on the field. So being able to take some scheduled breaks in terms of hydration and making sure that every athlete is very aware of how to use that mask appropriately. Not on their head, not under their chin, where it needs to be. And I'm serious.
Yes. Jen, any builds?
I think that's a very real concern, right? We can imagine that the ad lib drinking may very well be reduced, and which is kind of takes us back to this idea of monitoring and assessing hydration, particularly for those outdoor sports. So I do think, as we've thought through this idea of monitoring is key. It's important, and I think that just reinforces that concept of education on how athletes can monitor their own status and take that responsibility. And the other piece would be that, to implement some of these things may take extra resources, right? And that can be challenging for for some scenarios and some environments. However, if it's possible for athletes to be given or to have their own personal water bottle as they're moving around in and around the facility, sitting in, whether it's team meetings or just doing what they're doing, that can help so that they don't have to rely on a water fountain which may be shut down anyway, or minimal fluid stations throughout facilities or complexes. So this idea of being able to issue or distribute additional water bottles that are labeled and personalized, that the athlete is responsible for bringing to and from, and perhaps cleaning and sanitizing themselves at home, I think can go a long way in helping that issue.
And the one other thing about that, and we talked about this need to collaborate and communicate, is that when we look at, this is going to take more time than what normally would have been the case of hydrating. It's, oh, no, because you have to orchestrate with small amounts of athletes at a time instead of everybody at once. That needs to be built into practice time. It's very, very important that the athletic trainers and everybody who's the advocate for the athletes really says, look, we have to keep everybody safe, and we have to be able to schedule this appropriately of how these fluid breaks are going to happen so everybody's hydrated, they still get through practice, and you then eliminate the social distancing and you figure out how to work this with the mask.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned squeeze bottles and in having an athlete have their own bottle with them kind of at meetings throughout the day that follows them. If squeeze bottles are part of the guidelines that a team is using, what are the best practices for refilling those bottles throughout the day and during practice? Jen, let's kick that one to you.
Sure. And as Leslie said, this is going to take a little bit more time. It perhaps is going to take a little bit more resource. However, that said, the best practice that we know of right now would be that each athlete have their own individual water bottle for practices, for competitions, for general daily use. If we think about in practice, being able to, as Leslie said, collaborate with the coaching staff, that's going to be so key in making sure that those breaks are not only extended perhaps, but that there are more of them to allow for athletes to have their personal water bottle and perhaps refill it, which may take a little bit longer versus, for example, in a football scenario where shared bottles are the norm. That's no longer going to be able to be the case. Best practice will say that those athletes need to have their own bottle carried around from place to place, drill to drill. Perhaps there are 2 of those squeeze bottles on the field or on the court, where athletes, as they finish one, can go over, grab their other one from perhaps it's a pre-assigned station or area of that court or practice area, and that designated filler can refill without the athlete having to wait in line and take up valuable practice time.
And we make sure that those bottles are clearly labeled. So a new use for a Sharpie, it's not signing autographs, it's putting your name on your bottle, and also to identify those athletes that might be at higher risk because they are at higher risk for cramping, so that everybody knows what we need to do for those athletes, making sure that we have enough electrolytes available. And again, practice, so that everybody gets into the routine and courteous about it and understanding that this is the new norm. It is not going to be business as usual. It's entirely different.
Yes. Clearly, hydration is going to remain important. And I think there's going to be so many logistics to figure out, not only on the sidelines, but throughout a facility, at home, to do it safely. Go ahead, Jen.
I was going to add one more thing on the squeeze bottle concept. So most of these bottles are made from pretty hardy plastic, probably polypropylene or polyethylene. And this idea of, if it's going to be taken upon the team or the individual athlete, this idea of not only cleaning, but sanitizing and disinfecting. And I think it's important to point out that those are 3 separate and distinct processes that have different guidelines, right? So cleaning is going to essentially knock off dirt. Sanitizing is going to go in and neutralize and remove some of that viral contaminant. Disinfecting is another step and a whole that takes the it's typically a harsher chemical. It's going to go in and really remove that viral load. And with the COVID, the novel coronavirus, it's recommended that disinfectant step is really necessary to wipe away and remove the coronavirus. And so with the disinfectant concept, we need to make sure that we're using an appropriate one, and an appropriate one particularly for these plastics. And we can think about the typical cleaners that we have around the house or maybe around the facility, but it's going to be important during this time to make sure that we're using the right disinfectant for this coronavirus. There are specific standards and criteria that we need to meet, or that our chemicals need to meet in order to be effective. So we certainly don't want to go through the effort without knowing that what we're doing is going to be effective. So there is something called List N from the EPA that's a great site that folks can navigate to. Put in your cleaner. Right on the label will be an EPA registration number. If there isn't one, that's probably not a cleaner that you want to use. That EPA reg number should be on that label somewhere, and it'll be probably a grouping of 3 or 4 numbers with a dash. And there's a great website to put that in and see what that cleaner registers for, if it's effective for coronavirus, and for what type of surface. And again, that's going to be key to not only cleaning the bottles, but also our contact surfaces, particularly those that are in what we call the food contact category.
Thank you, Jen. That is incredibly important, helpful information. I think a lot of our athletes, if we can get them to wash, we feel like we are kind of winning to a degree, but we have to not be satisfied with that and keep going and make sure that we're disinfecting appropriately. Let's pivot a bit now from hydration and talk a little bit about performance. We have a question from Ezran. I hope I pronounced your name right. I'm sorry. Some schools are wearing masks during training, but there's a bit of a concern about an oxygen deficit while they are covered with a mask. How does nutrition aid in helping athletes feel less fatigued?
Well, having as a sport dietitian, when we really look at what is the equipment that we think is critically important, it is hydration and food. Those are the things that are going to definitely equip from the inside out. So if we have an athlete showing up on empty, chances are their performance is going to be pretty awful, and everything they do, the perceived effort of exertion, everything is going to be incredibly harder. So when we talk about warm up and cool down, part of warm up is the hand to mouth activity, not necessarily just stretching. Is that athlete having something before practice? That is incredibly important. This is not the time when we look at return to play to say, ooh, keto. I don't think so. It is the time that we're really trying to establish consistency with the number of meals a day, thinking about the quality of what's on the plate. That does not mean the most expensive food item. It means the composition of the plate geared towards the goals that that particular athlete has, that he or she is meeting every single day. If you're not coming prepared, then you're not going to be able to perform to the maximum. You're not going to repair appropriately, and everything is going to be a lot more difficult, let alone you become more susceptible to illness because your body is just getting too beat down.
Mm-hmm. Great. Staying on the nutrition topic, and specifically with macro and micronutrients, we have a question from Carmine, and this is a topic that is of particular interest for me, so I'm excited to hear your answers to it. Do you have any specific considerations for macro and micronutrients and potentially supplements that might be warranted for injury prevention as the intensity and duration of exercise are increasing at a rapid rate? Jen, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I agree. This is a huge concept that is another area where I think nutritional considerations bear a lot of cred here. So in terms of coming back, we certainly have, most of us have seen the reports from the NFL lockout. We've seen some of the European data coming back from those leagues, and that unfortunately are plagued with injury. And so from a macronutrient standpoint, we know that fatigue plays a big role in injury overall. And I think we mentioned earlier that carbohydrate is a key cornerstone macronutrient for energy management. And so, as Leslie said, this is not a time for keto. This is not a time to go low carb. We want to make sure that energy needs are being met. And for most sports, carbohydrate is going to be that primary energy driver. From a protein, so to reduce fatigue during sport, we want to meet carbohydrate needs. Protein is going to obviously be important as well in the equation, pointing to recovery, maintenance of lean body mass. So meeting protein needs are important as well. I might also add that the concept and the newer research on collagen for soft tissue management and perhaps injury reduction there bears a lot of interest and perhaps would be worthwhile if the environment and situation is appropriate. So using collagen about an hour, 15 grams prior to workout training may help with the soft tissue injury and maintenance.
And I would also add a couple of other things there. One being omega-3, right? We know not everybody's a fish eater, so there may be other ways to get that in if somebody wants to do something in terms of an omega-3 supplementation, or if they're looking at plant-based forms of it, there is that option to do. I think the other thing we need to think about is the wonders of produce. As a dietitian, right, I want people eating fruits and vegetables. What can I say? I do. But that doesn't always sound good. But when we think about them as phytonutrients, and let's not call it PHYTO, let's call it FIGHTO, is helping to fight off injury because of the role that those phytonutrients may play in terms of keeping the body healthy, of being anti-inflammatory. It's critically important. So, this idea of looking at beets and looking at berries and looking at pomegranate and looking at tart cherry and the role that they play, it is more than just a piece of produce. It may indeed be very, very protective. And those are the types of things, even when we look at the way that things are signed in cafeterias, even if you can't eat there, you may be able to get some information of what do I need to put on my plate if indeed my goal is to reduce my risk of injury. And the last thing is fluid. Right? It's above and beyond hydration. We're really looking at ways to optimize the health of the body, to have the best defense mechanism we can against injury. And that means that somebody has to be optimally hydrated every day, not just a couple days a week. It's the consistency of these behaviors each and every day.
Thank you.
I would add one more thing, Kim. I think that our listener asked us about supplements with regard to injury prevention. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention vitamin D. I know we mentioned that earlier, but there certainly has been a growing body of evidence showing that vitamin D status and perhaps a regular routine supplement can help, particularly from a neuromuscular standpoint, and help perhaps in this concept as well from an immune standpoint. So that's another one to consider.
Would you suggest where they are able, athletes getting tested for their vitamin D status?
I think if it's possible, it's always best practice, right? We don't necessarily want to blindly prescribe nutritional supplements if we don't have to. So if that's possible, that is ideal. There's plenty of published targets from a blood level standpoint out there that folks can look at and protocols based on working with your physician that your team would be comfortable with. However, that said, if that's not possible, there's certainly some screening tools out there that and questions you can ask to look at whether, for example, if the athlete's an indoor sport athlete, so is their sun exposure minimal? Do they have, what's their dietary intake? Do they have past medical history that might impact their level? So there are different variables there that could be used as a clinical screen as to whether someone might need a vitamin D supplement or not. I think a lot of researchers and practitioners are comfortable with anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 IUs per day as a sort of preventive dose. Leslie, maybe you can add on to that as well.
Well, yeah, having worked with professional teams for a long time, and every year we do screening, and every year we have a significant number of players who come back with low levels. And if your levels are suboptimal, it's really hard to do that with diet alone. It's just not going to happen. So yes, the supplementation to help to get them where they need to be, and looking at that from the standpoint of bone health, muscle health, but also is critically important for the immune system. So all of these things very much interplay. The other thing I would say about the injury thing in general, is just to kind of wrap this up, is that we have athletes, everybody has their different portal of entry of what's important. So some athletes focus on performance, right? There are some athletes who just focus on physique. I want that six-pack, and I don't really care, and I'm not talking beer. I don't really care what it is I have to do to get there. That's what I want. And then some athletes who need to think about physiology because of some underlying issues. So we have to meet those athletes where they are, what they're willing to do, and then move forward that way, which is what makes it personalized, but probably also what makes it more likely that they will be compliant and it's practical recommendations for them.
Okay, Leslie, we have a second question from Carmine. How might you address in a very simple and practical way to athletes the misconception that foods can boost your immune system?
We don't want it to boost the immune system. What we want to do is we want to support the immune system. And so, that's why when we think about how we might frame a plate, not using the word healthy, because people don't really care about the word healthy, but what they might care about is protective. Is this a protective plate for me? And what do I need to have on that plate to be protective? So some of the things we talked about already, the consistency with which one eats over the course of the day, the composition of that plate from the standpoint of produce, from the protein that's on that plate, the carbohydrate that is on that plate, the presence or absence of things that get in the way, such as alcohol, such as not having enough sleep, or such as very much restricting calories. So when we frame it positively, we're more likely to get buy-in. When we scold people, they tune us out, so that never works. But really trying to think about the words that resonate can be a way of garnering that interest across the board, and talking about the fact when you're talking to your athletes, it's not usually an N of one, it's an N of how many other players are on that team. So making that competition in a good way about what happens on that plate may be something that indeed resonates well.
Thank you. Jen, how can we help ensure that athletes that have specific dietary needs, including those who might be crampers and maybe, Gator Light users, how can we make sure their needs are being addressed safely?
Sure, that's an important question, particularly as we think about how we're reimagining our sidelines for during practices and competitions. So when we think about the individual squeeze bottle concept, if that's in place, what we want to do is to be able to identify those athletes who are at higher risk. And we can do that through a lot of different ways. Not only their personal history, looking at if they're a new athlete coming into your team, perhaps having a conversation with them about their cramping history, and then certainly day to day their evolving acute reactions to practices as we return back. But ultimately to build that list of high-risk athletes. And so once we know who those folks are and we identify them, then we can move to a process of how we get them those extra, whether it be sodium or electrolytes that they may need. And I think if we're going to think about that sideline setup as having dedicated fillers at these filling stations, they are going to be important in this process, and for them to know who are those high risk players, and for that dedicated filler who's masked, gloved, and cleaned and sanitized, for them to be the point person who fills their bottle with those added electrolytes and marks that bottle appropriately so that the athlete doesn't have to come over and use the shared bottle that we all know is is usually on the sideline. The one bottle that has the extra electrolytes in it. We need to move to that individualized concept, and essentially pre-filling those with pre-identification is going to be the best way to go.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other part of that too is for those athletes that have been identified as being at higher risk for cramping and maybe the salty sweaters, is having a discussion with them about their eating. What are they doing? The good news is that as we go towards packaged foods right now, there's always little packages of soy sauce and other things like that. And that is a safe way of putting more salt in, or for the student athletes, high school athletes that are living at home, of having that dialogue perhaps with parents of, can you cook the rice in a broth to get more sodium into the diet every single day? That's another very low cost way of helping to ensure that the intake is going up. And one of the things that I've seen over the years of working with high school athletes too is we might have a mom or dad or somebody else in the family who's on a low sodium diet for whatever reason. So nothing is cooked with any salt whatsoever. And meanwhile, we have an athlete who might be at higher risk. So, it's all about phrasing that in a way as we want you to do the best for your athlete. And here are some suggestions of ways to help them to optimize their intake each and every day.
Leslie, shifting gears again a bit. Earlier, you mentioned sleep when we were talking about nutrition and immune health. We have a question from Isaac related to sleep and immune health. Can you expand a bit more on the connection between sleep and a healthy immune system?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we know about sleep is that is the time for the body to restore, to refresh, to renew, and reset. And that is also when we're looking at hormone production, not just what's happening in terms of muscle protein synthesis. So if somebody is on all day long and then they're not sleeping well and the off switch never materializes, then it's putting more stress on the body each and every day. And sooner than later, there may indeed be some wear down effect. So we're really looking at being preventive of all the things that we want athletes to do in their waking hours. We're also talking about active sleep, trying to have them do the best they can in terms of finding the time to be able to chill out, zone out, rest, recover appropriately, repair, to help them prepare for the next bout of physical activity. And I don't think that can be said too many times. And I think all of us as the advocates for our athletes need to ask that question. In addition to, are you washing your hands with soap and water? How many hours are you sleeping a night? And how could you do better in terms of your sleep hygiene?
I think that's a great point that Leslie made in terms of the stress. When athletes are not meeting that 8 to 9 hour threshold, we know that their body is in a higher stress state. And our literature shows us that those cortisol levels are higher. We know that cortisol is a catabolic hormone and can wreak havoc, not only from a performance standpoint and on our lean mass, but as we know, can also raise inflammation, which we know can ultimately impact that immune system. So definitely a key role in maintaining and supporting our immune function through this period.
Mm-hmm. Can't impress enough on our athletes that they need to get to sleep, shut down the video games and go to sleep.
That's right.
Jen, we have a question in from Krista. Do you expect to see an increase in disordered eating as student athletes return to play? And is there anything else to remain attentive to?
Well, I'm glad. Thank you, Krista, for the question, and I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, I was just reading yesterday, I believe it was, Cindy Bulick from the UNC Center of Excellence for Eating Disorders just put out there that they've been doing some work during this time on the incidence of eating disorder, and they're just showing such conclusive work that eating disorder behavior is on the rise, and those that have been struggling in the throes of disordered eating or eating disorders, the impact has been magnified. And so, the idea of being vigilant on who might have had struggles with eating disorder or disordered eating prior to March, when the pandemic hit us and we halted all sport. coming back, it might be an important time to reassess and reevaluate within your own medical team on how that individual is doing. And also as we look at implementing the pre-participation exam or the PPE process, really making sure that those questions are part of that for our returning athletes as well as the incoming athletes can be important to help support those folks.
Mm-hmm. And I would just take a little bit different spin on that too. Is yes, this is a very big concern. Number one, because the accountability isn't necessarily there when you're talking with somebody on a screen. It's not the same when you have FaceTime and Embrace Time and you can physically see somebody head to toe. You're seeing just their face. That can be problematic. In addition to the true eating disorders or disordered eating behaviors, let's think about those that might be food insecure. That maybe when they were at school, they had opportunity for regular food, and maybe over these past couple of months, that hasn't been the case. So it's going to be critically important in the PPE to be able to ask those questions as well as how did you eat over these past few months, and really be able to hone in and address and identify those higher risk athletes so that maybe we move them a little slower through what the expectations might be for their sport to give their body a chance to replete so indeed they don't incur the risk of injury.
Okay. Leslie, what would you suggest if an athletic trainer, let's say for a high school team, and there's one athletic trainer with the team and they suspect an eating disorder with one of their athletes, what advice do you have for them?
Well, first of all, I think all of us have expertise in different areas, and it's hard to wear all the hats at once. That's very, very tough. But establishing a rapport is always number one, is approaching that athlete as I'm concerned about you. I've observed you during practice. You seem to be somewhat fatigued. Is everything okay? Sometimes you get a response, sometimes you do not. Having resources available is, yes, I have a sports dietitian that I work with, so at least making that resource there, and really trying to talk to the entire team, all of the athletes, about the importance of nourishing your body well. Then you're not singling out one individual, but that individual is also hearing the message. Everybody else is hearing the message at the same time. And if the possibility of support, is there somebody that athlete really trusts? Is it another teammate? Is it a parent? Is it a sibling? Whoever it is that you as an athletic trainer might be able to identify to at least start some kind of a conversation to really help that student athlete. I've had so many athletes that I've worked with that have eating disorders, and I work with a lot of certified athletic trainers as well. And sometimes athletes just feel like they're all alone. Nobody understands. They don't want to fail. And so we really have to be there with the pom-poms all the time, being the cheerleaders, being encouraging, but also being willing to have those tough conversations if we need to safeguard the health of that individual.
Thank you, Leslie.
Kim, I might add that, when we look at disordered eating at no matter what level it is, we can often see depression and anxiety coming along with, and we certainly know that this pandemic has brought out perhaps the second pandemic that's coming behind it, right, is the mental health of the world, the globe right now. And so for staffs, no matter what level, being aware and screening for and being really attentive to depression and anxiety, which then could possibly lead to, or vice versa, be part of a disordered eating diagnosis is key. And putting those resources, whether they're being used or not, as Leslie said, pulling those forward and just making sure that those are over-communicated so that folks have access or know what's available, because we certainly know that the mental health of our student athletes and everyone is certainly struggling at this time.
Thank you. Well, ladies, this hour has flown by, and we have time for one last question for both of you. Jen, we'll start with you and then go to Leslie. What are best practices to implement when faced with the challenge of feeding a large group of athletes?
That is a loaded question and a big one. I'm glad that you asked that. First and foremost, when we're feeding large groups of athletes, we're probably, depending on where you are and depending on the state in which you live in, and by the way, as we move through this, it'll be important to make sure that you and your teams are following state and local guidelines as well as federal guidelines, right? Because those are changing and they're slightly different from state to state. But most likely a dining hall or group dining, whether it be a training table or a dining hall, is not going to be possible, at least in the near future. And so first off, recognizing that. Then weaving into your protocol or your procedures, things like small group designations, staggered entrance and exit times for these small groups, attendance records for these groups for contact tracing purposes. Should someone be testing positive or come back with symptoms, the contact tracing component is going to be key for teams to be able to continue moving forward. The idea of the buffet, as Leslie said, that is gone. That is gone for the near future. And so this concept of essentially the box lunch, right, or the boxed meal is going to be our best practice right now. And so, again, working with your food service provider to set up that process for individualized meals. Remember to keep in mind doing a food allergy or individual needs profile of your team or your group so that we know who's got those issues and that which boxes may need to be prepared differently in the back of the house and labeled appropriately. Similarly, we want to have those boxes ideally, if they are a cold box, they want to be chilled. Hot certainly needs to be cooked to temperature, and I think it's a good idea for whoever that liaison is to be to work with and be in good contact with the kitchen staff in terms of, are they keeping food time and temp logs on their food, that should you need to review it, or if you want to review it from a proactive standpoint, you can, to make sure those food safety principles are being followed. Similarly, to make sure that when you're working with a food service staff, you have some sense of what their policies and procedures are in terms of how they're operating in the back of the house, meaning the kitchen. Are they social distancing in the kitchen? How are they handling their employees? Are they checking and doing a symptom check on their employees? And making sure that the food service or the food providers guidelines are in line with your sport and your team or your university or whatever the case may be, in line with your guidelines and your values for keeping your athletes safe.
And what I would like to add to that is even the idea for the athlete to take the responsibility of sanitizing, hand sanitizer in and out. That's critically important. And the use of apps can actually streamline things so that, you're not coming in and saying, oh, I want this, that, and the other. It's done ahead of time so that when we have to move a lot of people through in a relatively short period of time, it seems somewhat seamless instead of very, very disjointed. But the other is changing the expectation. I love athletes. I've been doing this for a long time. We have a lot of entitled athletes that are going to take offense to the fact that they can't have chia, kiwi, and who knows what else added to their smoothie. It's a new world right now because we're trying to have a safe world right now, and that means everybody needs to buy into the concept, but that also needs to be stated from the get-go so that there aren't any unhappy surprises as athletes come through to find what it is they need to find. And the other component of this is even thinking about what happened for their snacks, maybe over the course of the week, that maybe in some schools are thinking about it's a snack bag or a snack box. You get it at the beginning of the week with the number of snacks that you will need pre and post practice. If you eat them all on Monday, oh well. So, all of this is education and responsibility that the athletes need to be able to own up and step up because, again, we're trying to keep everybody safe and be as streamlined as we possibly can and also deal within a budget because that's another very, very big concern right now.
Thank you so much, Leslie and Jen. This discussion has been fantastic. Unfortunately, it's all the time that we have, but in this hour, we have learned a lot about what we need to do from a nutrition and hydration standpoint and what those guidelines should look like as we bring our athletes back. Please check out our Gatorade Performance Partner website for a series of resources related to this specific topic that I've been working with Leslie and Jen and their partner Roberta on, so that you can take these resources and use them with your athletes. Leslie and Jen, any final remarks before we sign off?
You know what? We're all in this together. I mean, literally, this is a learning curve. We certainly want to hear from all of you, too, of what it is that you're doing, or if you have questions. We will all navigate this. It's not going to be smooth sailing. It isn't. It's very, very choppy, but we all know we're in it for the same reason, is to help our athletes stay safe, play well, and be well.
Absolutely. There's just no blueprint for this. There's no perfect answer. We are moving through this together. I would say it's just a time to revisit those policies and procedures, revisit and revise those protocols, really pay attention to those guidelines. And, I know we're all putting our disciplines into that multidisciplinary team right now, and that's big.
If you guys want to check out more about Leslie and Jen and Roberta, or you have questions for them to go deeper, please go to their website, performance365.org, or they also are on Twitter. Before we wrap things up, we want to encourage everyone to join the Gatorade Performance Partner, the first multidisciplinary community of sports performance professionals. When you join this program, you're going to get benefits like complimentary CEUs, science-backed resources, and opportunities to discover all of the new things Gatorade has for you. Also, be sure to follow Gatorade Performance Partner on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn so you don't miss any of the exciting new updates. We hope you enjoyed this series of Gatorade Performance Partner Expert Chats. Thank you again to Leslie and Jen, and we look forward to staying in touch. Have a great night.